Welcome everyone to INA's Professional Webinar Series, an exclusive perk to our members where we bring professionals from outside of our industry and membership to share their knowledge and expertise with us. I am thrilled to inform that today's webinar is actually open to the public. Our presenters are special guests from Hand in Hand Domestic Employer Network. This webinar will focus on recommendation for employing a childcare provider, but agencies and employers of house cleaners and home care attendants will also learn helpful information. Hand in Hand is a national network of employers of nannies, house cleaners, and home attendants, families, and allies. They believe that dignified and respectful working conditions benefit worker and employer alike. Hand in Hand envisions a future where people live in caring communities that recognize all of our interdependence. And to get there, Hand in Hand support employers to improve their employment practices and to collaborate with workers to change cultural norms and public policies. You can learn more about them at domesticemployers.org.
Hand in Hand is a network of domestic employers, and we believe that it benefits everyone when our homes become workplaces that are just, fair, and kind. We know that in the domestic work sector, the relationship we form with workers in our homes is one of deep interdependence, that we need each other. So we help people figure out how to be good employers, and then we work with each other and alongside domestic workers to transform the domestic work and care work sectors to make care and support more accessible to everyone. My own relationship to caregiving and why this work is important to me is that when my family moved here to the Bay Area, we didn't have any family in town. And so it was just up to me and my partner to find housing and find childcare for our two kids who were just turning 1 and had just turned 4 at the time, in addition to starting new jobs. And we were fortunate to get connected to a really amazing nanny through some friends that we had in the area. And she was great. And we also realized a couple weeks into our employment with her that we needed more hours, and because she was a part of a share across town, she wasn't able to provide those hours. And so it was really difficult for us to figure out how to just sever that relationship ethically, because we didn't really have any guidelines. It was just, I think, similar to the situation that a lot of nanny employers find themselves in, which was that we were just kind of talking to other people that we knew. And a few months after that, I learned about Hand in Hand and about the resources that we provide. And so I know now that agreements that are really helpful, because they help nanny employers really think about all the issues that might come up when they hire someone. And I just wish that we had had those resources when we started. So that's why I really appreciate the work that Hand in Hand does. And because there's so many of us, we won't get to tell each of our stories today like we would in local workshops, but lots of you have been introducing yourselves in the chat, and we'll get a sense of our little community today. With a quick question. So one thing that we like to do in our in-person workshops is just to kind of frame what it is to be an employer experiences as workers. And so if everyone could just pause for a moment right now and just consider, what it is that you appreciate as a worker. And if you want to, you can share that in the chat box. Just one thing that you really appreciate in wherever it is that you work in your employment relationship, like what makes you feel valued? What is it that helps you understand that you're doing a good job, for instance? Okay, so it's okay if folks don't want to share. I'm going to move us along just so that we can stay to our hour. Oh, I see. Thank you, Anna, for sharing proper and fair compensation, as well as an open line of communication. I see someone shared trust and confidence, constructive feedback, and good communication. So yeah, one of the reasons why we do that in our local workshops is really to help people understand that when they do become an employer in their home, the things that they appreciate in their workplace are oftentimes what the worker, the nanny in their home would appreciate as well. those responses. And we also know that it's really common for people to hire help in the home. In fact, there are many more domestic employers in this country than we may realize. In New York and California, our research shows that there are over 3.5 million households that employ, but people don't always talk about this. And part of our job at Hand in Hand is to bring the work that happens behind closed doors into the light. So now I'm going to share some context to explain why domestic work can be such a tricky subject, tricky enough that we're all on this call together, and why it isn't just an individual issue, but something bigger. So a brief history of domestic work. Domestic workers are nannies, house cleaners, and home care attendants. And the history of this industry helps us understand why organizing in this world happens at the intersection of racial justice, labor, and gender justice. So domestic workers were excluded from labor protection since the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It explicitly excluded domestic workers and actually farm workers as well, the right to form unions, and the right to access basic, kind of really basic labor protections that a lot of benefit from, like overtime pay. And this was a direct legacy of slavery because it was a bid to get Southern legislators to sign on. They knew that if they didn't exclude domestic workers and farm workers, that there was really no way that the bill was going to get passed. So since then, domestic workers and farm workers actually have been working to become protected by these basic labor protections. And our partners at the National Domestic Worker Alliance have been organizing to win domestic worker protections. Employers have joined with workers in New York to pass our country's first ever Bill of Rights and to include domestic workers under basic labor protections. And that happened in 2010. Then in California and now 6 additional states, with Seattle starting the first municipal Bill of Rights campaign, and that passed just last year. This is one of the few industries with workers and employers literally organizing together, and Hand in Hand plays an important role in that. We continue working with domestic worker movements around the country to do more Bill of Rights and culture change. And Tati was actually at the launch of the National Domestic Worker Bill of Rights bill announcement earlier this week. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the call, but that's something that's happening right now, and it's really exciting. And we realize also, though, that passing legislation isn't enough, especially in an industry that is so isolated. Employers. Hand in Hand was founded by domestic employers who drew on their own experiences of confusion and isolation in trying to figure out how to be good employers, kind of like the experience that I was just talking about. So My Home is Someone's Workplace is the workshop that we living rooms, in businesses that serve parents, in schools and these institutions. And that's what our webinar is based on, one in your own community. So all of this is based on an assumption of good intent, that we all want to do the right thing. We're employing workers often in moments of great change and crisis in our own lives, and no one hands us a personnel manual. We don't have a human resources person that comes home with the baby. So we start with the basics, which is that however much we feel like a family, domestic workers are workers, and this is a labor relationship. A lot of times these relationships are very intimate, especially when they're good, and it can feel pretty different from other work relationships. Many times people will say that the person they employ feels like a part of the family, but in fact, we have more success in these relationships and are better employers when we recognize that we're not family, it's an employer-employee relationship, and our homes are in fact workplaces. And that's complicated, and that's why we're all here today. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rachel for a moment to just introduce herself and how she became involved with Hand in Hand.
Hi, so I'm Rachel Kahn. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm the working mother of 2 small children. I've employed house cleaners for 6 years, a nanny for 4 years, and for many years, a home health attendant to care for a relative with dementia. So I really have been very personally involved in a lot of home worker situations. But I got involved with Hand in Hand after learning about their work from a neighbor. When I was first hiring a nanny, I had a lot of the same kind of isolation that Suzanne was talking about. I was starting from scratch. I had no idea what the right standards were in terms of pay or time off, or how to find someone great to take care of my baby, how to be a good employer so that good people would want to work for me. And I feel like a lot of people are in the same boat, and Hand in Hand was a great resource for me. And so now a lot of what I do for Hand in Hand is try to share the kind of information that I wish I had had when I was starting out as an employer, so that other people who are doing what I did 4 years ago get really good tools at the beginning of the process to make the process easier for employers and for nannies. And I think that if you have a clear idea of what your responsibilities are as an employer and what a fair salary and fair benefits are, and maybe know a little about like what not to do, you can get started in a way that's positive and energizing with that relationship. And that positive energy will really carry you through any bumps in the road that you might hit when you go along. So I always say that it can be really helpful when we're trying to figure out how to be good, respectful employers to kind of ground our approach in our own experiences as employees in the workplaces where we work. And, you know, if you're not sure what the right thing to do as an employer is, it's sort of old fashioned to say, like, put yourself in someone else's shoes. But I really try and put myself in the role of the worker and see if the answer becomes more clear, and think, if I were in this situation with my boss, like, how would I want my boss to treat me? So Suzanne will throw it
Yeah,
back.
that's great. Thank you, Rachel. So at Hand in Hand, we found through conversations with both employers and employees that there are three important things to remember to foster a respectful relationship with those we hire. And those make up the Fair Care Pledge, which is the basis of all of our tools and resources. The pledge was launched with the support of the National Domestic Worker Association and with Care.com, and it received the endorsement of President Obama. It simplifies the key priorities in the employer-employee relationship. The Fair Care Pledge is meant to be a good faith statement of intention and a starting point. It means that you commit to doing the best you can by the person you employ, and not about making people feel bad if they don't do everything. So the 3 points of the Fair Care Pledge are fair pay, clear expectations, and paid time off. And we're going to go through those individually.
So we'll go through these somewhat quickly, but don't worry, because this is recorded. You can return to it. We'll send you all the resources that you need afterwards. And of course, you can always follow up with questions in the chat. Fair pay is really the bedrock of being a good employer. I'm sure that that's come up for many of you. Our first tip is to pay a living wage. And sometimes I found that as an employer, when I was starting out, I did not know what that was. But Hand in Hand recommends at least $15 to $25 an hour. That takes into account where you live, if the person is doing extra work like childcare and also cleaning or doing laundry. And of course, it takes into account how many children they're caring for at one time. And there is a living wage calculator for your area on the Hand in Hand website that you can look and see. It can be a little more complicated for home health attendant sort of employers, because some of their funding might come from Medicare or state funding. And so we recognize those constraints. This is actually a very important part of what Hand in Hand is working on when it comes to the affordability of care. Tip number 2, pay for overtime. The best practice is to pay time and a half. So after an 8-hour day or anything more than a 40-hour week, any additional hours, you should pay time and a half. And in some states, like New York and California, a Bill of Rights now guarantees domestic workers that overtime. So it's a good idea to check where you live, because some states and cities have passed ordinances, and paying overtime is a responsibility for them. Tip number 3, pay reliably. You should pay a mutually agreed upon schedule, whether that's every week or every other week. Don't pay your employee late. I mean, that should sort of go without saying, but it does happen. Even if you have to cancel at the last minute, even if you suddenly decide you're going to go out of town that day, and you don't need you sort of don't need the person to come into your home that day. Domestic workers depend on a steady paycheck. So for example, if you say that you had a meeting that was canceled, and so you get off work early and you kind of can go home and you don't need your caregiver for the day, we really recommend that you still pay even if the caregiver isn't working that day, because your plans changed at the last minute and she doesn't have control over that. They have obligations to their family. So it is really important, especially in a business where these workers are not overpaid, that we really remember that they depend on the steady paycheck from week to week, and it's our obligation to make sure that they have a steady stream of income.
So open and respectful communication will be the foundation for the relationship between the two of you, providing clarity on both sides for daily tasks. And this is our second recommendation, clear expectations. The first tip is that clear expectations start at the hiring process. Discussing exactly what you need while you're interviewing is a great way to make sure that whoever you hire is on the same page as you. For example, thinking back to the example of having a changing work schedule, if it's not easy for you to predict your schedule, that's something you can let people know when you're interviewing candidates. We have resources for other things to consider, like sample work agreements for nannies and other types of domestic workers on our website. And I'll go ahead and put that link in the chat box in a moment, but it's domesticemployers.org. And it's just under the tab for resources, FAQs and templates. We also have a checklist tool that takes folks through a series of, it's like 10 pages of questions, but it's a really good way for domestic employers to kind of think through all of the questions that might come up. And then at the end, they will be emailed the results of what they checked off on the checklist. So our second tip is to make a work agreement together now and update it as work changes. Things change, that's just life. And I think all of us have had work situations where our job description has changed, and sometimes with not very much notice, but it's really important to have expectations in writing and to update them when they change. And this is to both of your benefits, and that you're not kind of relying on like, oh, I think we said this or that. We really recommend putting it in writing. Our third tip is to have regular check-ins and an open door for conversations. So we do recommend scheduling weekly check-ins, even if it's only for 5 or 10 minutes, and then also scheduling larger reviews, maybe on a quarterly or twice a year basis. Our fourth tip is feedback. So creating a situation with the nanny where you can discuss the good to focus on problem solving together. Hopefully all of us know what good feedback looks like, and I'm sure that we all have experienced bad feedback as well. So again, if you could think about how you'd like to receive feedback at your job and what that sounds like, and then trying to implement that in your home, and also making space for your employee to bring up any challenges or concerns is really important as well. So just setting up a space where you can offer critical feedback from the beginning is a really good practice to start before like issues become larger. And our final tip is to say hello and communicate with respect. It might seem really basic, but oftentimes when folks are heading out the door and need to get somewhere, it can be really easy to forget. So again, the easiest way to think of this is, how do you like to be treated and to interact with others where you work? And this is something that workers often say makes a big difference in how they feel about their workplace, and oftentimes how long they will stay in a position.
Mm-hmm. So the next thing to talk about is paid time off. Our first tip on that is to provide paid sick days. This is sort of a no-brainer because chances are you really don't want someone sick working in your home if you can help it. And you really want whoever's working in your home to be physically and mentally well rested, because they're going to do the best possible job. So for full-time employees, the best standard is at least 5 paid sick days per year, or for a part-time employee, an hour banked for every 30 hours worked. In some states and cities, this is the law. For example, in California, all full-time employees are supposed to earn at least 3 paid sick days per year. And I know New York City recently passed a similar law. Tip number 2 is about paid vacation, and I always get a lot of questions about this. For full-time employees, the sort of beginning standard is 2 weeks of paid vacation per year, ideally at the time that they can choose or that you can both agree to. I know in my own home, it's actually, we give our nanny 3 weeks of paid vacation per year, and we choose 2 of those weeks and she chooses 1 of those weeks. For part-time employees, it's the same as the sick time off. It's 1 hour earned for every 30 hours worked. And really the best way to do this is to prorate the time off. So if you choose to schedule a last-minute family vacation and you think you're not going to need your nanny for a few weeks, that's not the same as her being able to choose the vacation that works for her. I mean, she may have her own family schedule and time away to take into account, or her own children's school schedule. So try to be conscious about not forcing your own family's schedule onto your worker inadvertently, and don't always expect that your vacation time is going to match up with their vacation time. I think it's really a good thing to put this in the work agreement, and you can offer vacation time to be negotiated at a time that you both choose, or be clear if you have non-negotiable vacation time, like you always travel to the same place each year. Make sure that they're aware of that up front. And this is really important during summer months. So here are 3 steps for sort of paying reliably and offering paid time off. One is plan a good time to talk about it with the nanny who you employ, like get out a calendar and pick a time. And then think through these questions, like what agreement do you have in place about paid time off? And if you don't, it's a good time to bring it up. What are your confirmed summer travel plans? Do you still have plans that are in the works and you might not know until later? And how often do you need help throughout the summer? Like what kind of help will you need in the fall? And when does the fall schedule, maybe the school schedule, begin for your family? And you want to remember to ask your nanny, like, what are their vacation plans? What might change for them during the summer? Because they usually have family schedules they have to take into account as well. Suzanne?
If you, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So if you do employ a house cleaner, as a lot of nanny employers do, we have an exciting new piece to add to the conversation for the first time. There's now a way that employers can contribute $5 extra each time their house is cleaned, and these contributions from multiple employers get pooled to provide benefits. The program's called Aaliyah, and it's created by our partners at the Fair Care Labs, and we're posting a link to it right now. It's a portable benefits platform from the National Domestic Worker Association Labs. And again, it provides benefits such as paid time off and insurance to house cleaners. What they can use it for is a little a guarantee across all states in the US. So basically it pools contributions, $5 per cleaning of all employers into one account for a cleaner. And it's a solution to a long-standing problem facing house cleaners with multiple employees to be able to access paid time off and important benefits that put the power in the workers' hands. We believe it has the power to transform the industry and the world of work. It was created by workers for workers. And so if anyone on the call today is a house cleaner employer or works with folks who are, we really recommend this tool. So again, we know that in real life, these recommendations, play out in different ways. And so I'd like to invite Rachel to speak again, just to share more about her employment relationship and how she's helping to raise standards, not just for her own employee, but for other workers as well.
So one of the things that I work really hard to share with other families, particularly like the Facebook groups that I belong to, or at some of these webinars, is how consistency is so incredibly important for domestic workers like nannies and house cleaners. I definitely know families who will just say to the nanny, oh, we don't need you this Friday because we're going out of town, or I'll be home from work. And then they don't want to pay the nanny for that day because they're like, oh, well, I gave her the day off. But the truth is that that day off, when you don't pay her, just cut the nanny's weekly take-home pay by 20%. And if my weekly pay was cut by 20% a couple times a month, I'd really feel it. And nannies are working on tight budgets as it is. So this is why I always want to reemphasize that all of us want the security of knowing that our paycheck will be the same amount every week or every month. And I think that sometimes employers can forget that, or they'll think like, well, I can save myself a little money this week. And that kind of nickel and diming is pretty common, and it hits nannies really hard. So I always speak up and remind people that if you want consistent, reliable care for your kids, you have to be someone who is consistent and reliable when it comes to setting hours and paying your worker. The same is also really true with house cleaners, because they're working on a per visit basis. And so it's very important to their livelihood that they have consistent work and that they have basically the same number of visits every week or every month. So when employers drop a visit without rescheduling it, that missed job puts a real dent in their weekly income or their monthly income. And if it happens a couple times in a month, which is really common, like in the summer, because people will go on vacation, it can mean the difference between making the rent that month for them and like not making the rent that month. So I try to convince people to think of house cleaning as just like something they do X number of times per month, and then try to be as consistent as possible. So if you are going out of town and you miss that job, maybe you make it up later or you do something different. Like, for example, sometimes if I know that we're going to be out of town around the holidays or in the summer, I'll schedule something like a deep cleaning session for when we're out of town, so that the worker still has a job to come to that month, and we leave a task full of things that they may not necessarily always do on a weekly basis. And then it's great because we come home to a really clean house, and at the same time they haven't missed that scheduled visit, so it helps them maintain a really good consistent pay.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Those were really great suggestions. So through Hand in Hand in the Fair Care Pledge, anyone who signs up will get ongoing support and community. It's a community of folks supporting each other in the process of becoming respectful employers and breaking out of isolation in a time that can be hard and emotional for many families. I'm going to go ahead and share a link where you can affirm your commitment to these 3 principles that we just shared. So please sign the pledge today if you haven't already. I just put it in the chat box. And I think we're going to open up to questions now. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And while folks are doing so, I can explain a little bit more about the resources that we offer to members who sign the Fair Care Pledge. So it's not only a really great way to affirm that you're putting your values into practice, but when you do sign, we will send you a series of emails that break these principles down one at a time, so you can think about them and implement small changes over time. The other thing that's really important on this call today is that since we're being hosted through the International Nanny Association, which is really great, we actually don't have access to any of your email addresses to send you follow-up materials. So you can either sign the Fair Care Pledge, and that would give us access to your email address, or you could just message it to me before the end of the call today, because we do have additional resources that we can send people. So I see a couple questions. This is a really common one that comes up, at least in our workshops in the Bay Area. And Rachel, I'm guessing the same is true for you in New York, about nanny shares.
Yeah.
So Kim has a question about any suggestions for nanny shares. Do you have any that you want to start with, Rachel?
I do. I've seen really great ones, and I've seen ones that kind of went horribly wrong. I think that one of the most important things to do is you want to be consistently in touch with the other family who you're sharing the nanny with. I've seen situations where the 2 families kind of didn't have their communication down, and so the nanny was being told different things by different families, or the one family treated the nanny significantly different, either in terms of the way they respected her personally, or the way they respected her time and the things that they asked her to do. So you really do want to try and stay on the same page as the person who you're doing the share with, just so that both families are really consistent in the treatment of their nanny, and to kind of maintain open lines of communication. And then, I think it can be a really great relationship that works out well for everyone. So Suzanne, you were in a nanny share. I actually have never been in a nanny share. Did you have any?
Well, we were not able to work it out.
It didn't work out. I think that's one of the things that's hard, because people's needs change. And I've definitely seen situations, we had this with a Hand in Hand member not long ago, where basically they wanted to drop the other family because they were so unhappy with the way the other family was treating the nanny, that they then kept her on and went out to kind of try and matchmake with another family. And it worked out really well, because they had really good intentions. So, and they were able to find someone else. So it can be a little bit tricky because then you're actually looking for matchmaking where you find the right match in the nanny, but then you also really have to find the right match in the share family.
Yes.
So it's worth investigating. And, you know, I would say even having conversations about some of the things that we bring up here about we need to have a contract where we agree on what the overtime pay is going to be, what our paid time off is going to be. These are the hours that we'll expect her to work. These are all the duties that we expect her to do. So, you know, if one family expects the nanny to do all the laundry in addition to the childcare and the other doesn't, that's also something that needs to be resolved. So definitely have really, you know, good informational conversations with your share partner before you get into the relationship, and that will save you a lot of trouble down the line.
Yeah, I would just recommend our sample work agreement again, because it is 10 pages long and it literally covers everything, including like what is your policy around social media. And so obviously it's something that the families in a nanny share would negotiate with the nanny, but it would be a really good place for two families that were thinking about nanny shares to start, because they would have prompts basically to talk through like a lot of different issues. And I think what you're saying, Rachel, about like if the families are not good matches, some of that would come up as they were talking about the contract. And then the question also was like specifically around time off and vacations for nanny shares. That would be something that you would write into the work agreement as well. So you would establish what the rate would be for when both families are present for the nannies, and then, you know, anticipating that probably the families are going to take some vacations or time off at different times, then there would be a specific rate for if the nanny were just with one child. And that would be something that the nanny would agree with as well. There was another question about earlier about nanny interviews. Kim was wondering if nanny interviews should follow best practices as would other job interviews. And my response was yes. So clearly it's a very intimate relationship. And so I know that we've had people actually email our like info@domesticemployers.org email address with a question about like, could you ask about the nanny's religion? And neither Rachel nor I are attorneys, and so we're not here to give legal advice, but I believe the recommendation we gave was that like you would not specifically ask someone, but you could say, you know, my family's Jewish and we observe these holidays, and how comfortable would you be sort of doing these, you know, like religious practices with our child if the holiday were to, you know, be on a day that you worked or something like that. Like you could kind of ask specific questions about your own family's priorities, or like how comfortable are you with kids who are exploring like gender nonconformity, and, you know, like we found that, you know, you could give an example and kind of ask them a question like that. So rather than asking sort of prohibited job interview questions, you could provide an example of something that's really important value to your family, and then just check their comfort level around those things. Do you want to add anything, Rachel?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think yes, you want to be mindful about the appropriateness of questions in the same way that, you know, you probably would not expect too many questions about your personal life, your marital status, your religion, those sort of things when you went for a job interview. Like Suzanne said, if there's something like, you know, you keep a kosher home, or you know, if you have nanny who's from a religion where they don't believe in alcohol and there's alcohol in the house, you know, those kinds of things should come up, and hopefully if those are priorities for them, they bring them up. But I also, you know, I think that when I have had questions where people say, well, you know, if I'm doing an interview, should they bring a resume? And, you know, not all nannies will have a resume, but they definitely should have references. And I always say, like, you want to check the references. I was very reassured when I called my nanny's previous employer, and they talked about how wonderful she was, and she was still babysitting for their children many years after she'd stopped working for them full time. So definitely ask for references, check the references. But otherwise, yeah, it's a job interview, and, you should feel free to ask questions that relate to the job and what your expectations are, and then really listen. I think sometimes employers don't necessarily listen closely to the responses, and listen, and that will also tell you a lot about what the nanny's like.
Yeah, that's great. There was another question about, well, there was a question about if we recommend an agency software or databases for storing candidates and clients. We don't have any recommendations for that because we work specifically with kind of individual employers of domestic workers. But there was another question about household employer taxes. So we do encourage people to pay on the books. And we also recognize that many employers and workers prefer not to be paid on the books for a variety of different reasons. It doesn't always have to do with someone's immigration status. It could have to do with benefits that that they have access to that, you know, a certain income would disqualify them for. So yeah, we basically give these recommendations of the Fair Care Pledge to everyone, regardless of whether they're paying on the books or not. But we oftentimes do recommend some resources that people can turn to. So myhomepay.com is a really common resource that's hosted by care.com. They actually offer free consultations over the phone in terms of payroll and taxes. And then we also became aware of an agent or a new service locally in the Bay Area that's open to anyone, but it's called nestpayroll.com. And so I'll go ahead and post those two in the chat box. But Nest Payroll is, they're trying to do it for a lower cost, but they really are keeping nannies in mind with their services. And it actually is being developed by two former nanny employers. So they're good folks, and we're recommending that service as well. Let's see. Oh, it says the checklist link can't be found. I can go ahead and post that again. Let's see. Rachel, did you want to add anything, or did you see any questions that I missed?
No, but maybe more will come up. So
yeah,
I was gonna ask you about, like, they asked about the nanny traveling with employers, and I think that's a question that comes up a lot for us in the INA member group. I can read it to you.
Yeah, could you?
Yeah. So any thoughts on the compensation when a nanny travel with the family? What is the household employer responsibilities for? Should it be still follow the schedule, or should be recompensed for 24/7?
I mean, again, I think that's something that this is where you need to have open lines of communication. I think that in many cases that I'm aware of, one of the practices that I'm the most familiar with is that you would pay the nanny the regular sort of wage for the day. Plus, and that's assuming that they're just working for you. So if normally they would work an 8-hour day for you, that they would work that 8-hour day and then they would be off. And then usually I've heard quoted about $100 on top of the daily rate for the night, assuming that, they're spending the night or traveling with you. And of course, all their travel costs should be covered. So, yes. And that you also, I think this is one of those things with communication. It's really important to hammer out things like, is the nanny going to have her own room? If you're going to be in a hotel, are they going to be expected to sleep in the same bedroom with the children? If you're going to a rental house or a relative's house, are they going to have their own bedroom and their own space so that theoretically, like when they're off duty, they can go sleep? And are there going to be any other things that you want to negotiate in? So if you're going on vacation, maybe you want to take a date night out, and so you'd ask the nanny to also do several additional hours of nighttime babysitting. Those are things that should be compensated. So I usually would say, like, figure out your day rate, add the extra money on top of that, or you can talk with the nanny and sort of negotiate an all-in-one. Say if it's like a long weekend, you figure out what seems like a fair amount. I really think that a lot of times if you ask, they will come up with a number, and I think that it's worth asking.
Great. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, and We do need to move on, but there was one more question about tax deductions for employers when they're employing a nanny. You definitely would have to be paying that myhomepay.com. There
Oh, yeah.
would be really specific questions about
I
that.
can answer that. If you're talking about, like, if you have a dependent care flex spending account, which I do have, I'm very familiar with this. You have to usually be paying on the books in order to access that. And so that's actually where like a home payroll service is super helpful, because then you have what are the equivalent of pay stubs that you can then use to get yourself reimbursed. I think the maximum amount is $5,000 a year, which frankly is like a drop in the bucket, but every little bit helps.
Yeah, so that's why we always in our workshops talk about the legislative and systemic change that we're working towards as well. So yeah, because a $5,000 deduction, I agree with you, does feel like a drop in the bucket. So Rachel, do you want to move on to the next section?
So in the days following the 2016 election, we have really discovered that there's a whole new way to be a good employer. In this particular political moment, we have heard a lot from employers of immigrant workers about how they're concerned for the well-being and the safety of their workers, and they really ask for guidance on this as well. So we started Sanctuary Homes, which is a grassroots organizing campaign for all of us to get involved and do our part as employers to make our homes and communities safe and welcoming, and to defend our neighbors and our immigrant communities and the groups being targeted right now by this administration. So the campaign isn't really about sanctuary in the traditional sense. It's an expanded sanctuary movement. There's not just one group of immigrants. It's not just about Muslims or refugees or people of color. People are being targeted across the board regardless of status. So, you know, it's great to march and protest if that's what you do, but I think there's the bigger question of, are we bringing the politics home? Because, you know, our personal relationships with our employers, employees, it's very political. So there are three action levels on this. There's home, there's your neighborhood network, and the kind of broader community, whether that's faith-based organizations, civic organizations, just really your neighborhood and how you work to influence the situation and really create, if your home is a good, safe place where there's respect for your workers, and then you project that message outward as people like Suzanne and I are trying to do. We really think that we all have a role to play in making our homes and our communities a sanctuary where workers will be treated fairly. And for those of us who employ a domestic worker, have close relationships to targeted communities, to immigrant communities, to low-income communities, women of color who do the work in our homes. I think we have a special responsibility. I know that I feel a special responsibility to be the kind of ethical employer who helps support them in what we're going through in this political time.
Yeah, so if you've been paying attention to the news over the past year, you are probably aware that the administration has been detaining migrant families at the border. And so our members at Hand in Hand have taken on opposing this inhumane treatment as a campaign for sanctuary homes, insisting that these families be treated with dignity and respect. I think especially this has hit really close to the nanny employers, because we do all have small children and can really, you know, feel this deeply. And so our focus earlier this year was to pressure JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo banks to stop investing in private detention corporations, which were Geo Group and CoreCivic, from profiting off the detention of these families. And they actually did. So those companies, because of consistent pressure by Hand in Hand and a lot of other organizations, were recently joined by SunTrust, Bank of America, and a few other banks. I believe actually that the private prison companies have lost something like 70% of their investment over the past 6 months. And then earlier this month, we relaunched the Playdate protest campaigns that we were doing last summer. So if you want to know more about these campaigns and others, or if you're interested in getting involved, you can text join in to 97779 to learn about future actions and how you can make a difference for immigrant families. And so with that, I'm going to move us to talk about what we can do after we sign off today. So typically we do a poll, but again, we're going to skip over those today. But you can see Tati just put up a slide now that kind of the action steps that we're asking are to sign the Fair Care Pledge. You can take a 7-question survey that I'll post a link for at the end of the webinar that just kind of gives us a sense of like what you learned from the webinar and what you still have questions about. You could join the Sanctuary Homes campaign that Rachel talked about. You could choose just one improvement to your employment. And again, if you, to your employment practices that you can begin doing right away. And again, if you sign the Fair Care Pledge, that's one way to get ongoing resources to just kind of reconsider your employment practices. You can bring this workshop to your community, and you can also share the resources with others. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the 7-question survey in just a moment. And I think, Rachel, it's back to you. So, and one more thing is just that, again, we don't have your contact information. So if you do want to get involved, you can also just message me your email address, and I'll be sure to send additional resources your way.
Okay. And so as we said earlier, in addition to these webinars and other education, we work with our partners at the National Domestic Workers Alliance to pass legislation to win rights and dignity for domestic workers. So there are now 9 states that have passed the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. New Mexico just passed one a week ago, and 1 municipal Bill of Rights in Seattle. So Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia are also working on other legislation that we're organizing to support. So this may be really coming to your home if it's not there already. So if the resources that we shared today were helpful, or you're excited to learn about organizing, join us. I joined a couple of years ago. It's really been a great experience. You can become a member by paying $60 a year or more, and those resources keep our work going, and the link to join will show up in your chat box. So why don't we try and kind of end this call on a high note? I'd like to say, maybe you could just type into the chat box something that you're taking away in your head or your heart or your hands. If it's something new that you learned, something you're feeling, hopefully you're kind of leaving this webinar feeling better than when you came in. Maybe there's something that you'll do differently or look for differently in your employment relationship. So thank you, not only just for joining us today, but for being people who care about others, because that's why you showed up, and about doing the right thing. And we really appreciate you for that. Thanks to Suzanne and Tati. And as we say goodbye, we'll just leave the screen up for a minute. You can grab any contact information that you'd like from us. So thank you. We wish you all the best of luck, and we will be in touch, and please be in touch with us.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was amazing. So we're very excited to have you guys here. And I think that was, amazing information for agencies, from nannies that it can pass on to their employers, as well as for families. And we are hoping that, the Joy will have lots of resources. And when we upload this, I will make sure that we have the links also on the bio, so folks can, I'm not sure how it works with the chat, to be honest. So I'm not sure if the links will be available there afterwards, but I'll make sure that we have here. And as they said, folks, if you leave your email or if you get in touch with them, you can get the resources yourself. They will give you notifications from what's going on. So make sure you do that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tati, for hosting us. I also realized that the last thing we wanted to talk about was just the National Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which got some really good headlines this week. And so the last link that I'll put in the chat box is just a petition to basically say that you support this National Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. So it would be a way to implement domestic worker protections nationally. So instead of just the 7 states that have their own protections and the 1 city, it would extend to domestic employers, including nannies across the United States. And I know that we do have some nannies on the call today. And I see that Kim already signed the petition, so that's wonderful. So yeah, I think in like a couple days, they have had over 20,000 people sign. And so it'd be great if folks on the call today added their names as well. But again, thanks everyone for joining today. It was really good to get your questions, and thanks for giving us your time.
Awesome, thank you. And we are actually, I'm planning on having a Q&A with folks from NWA to come and talk to us about the federal bill. So stay tuned. We're going to have that in the next month or so, month or two.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and we are scheduling a domestic worker history webinar with Hand in Hand for the month of August. So, and that's in collaboration with the National Domestic Worker Alliance as well. So, yeah, if you go to our website, see information about that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, guys. I think that's all we have. Do we have any final questions? I think,
Okay.
yeah, I think that's it.
Right.
All right. Well,
All
thank
right,
you for
thank
joining.
you.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Yeah, good night, everybody.